Recording, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So you guys should be seeing the PowerPoint if all went well. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Best Practices for Interlibrary Loan. This is the second webinar in our ongoing SEAL webinar series. So some of you might have took SEAL 101 last month. But just in case you haven't met me before, my name is Kelsey Milner, and I am the Resource Sharing and Cataloging Librarian here at Southeastern Library Resources Council. This is actually a brand new webinar. This is the first time I'm putting this one on. And basically this training is going to do a deep dive into our regional interlibrary loan code. And this document is kind of the closest thing that we have to a rule book for using SEAL. It lays out the specific responsibilities and some best practices of borrowing and lending libraries throughout an ILL transaction. We also have a set of regional ILL procedures that kind of break down the code into a specific workflow. So I'll also be talking about that briefly as well. In my SEAL 101 training, we usually only have just a couple minutes at the very end of the training to kind of dive into the code and procedures, just because there is so much to cover in that training. So I did think it would be really helpful to have a full webinar that just looks at the code and specifically at best practices. So I'm going to be stopping periodically throughout the presentation to check for questions. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to see them when they come in through the Zoom screen share, so I'll just kind of stop once in a while and check to see if people have any questions. So this is the layout for today's webinar. We have quite a few topics. Once I started working on the webinar, I realized there was quite a lot to say on this topic. So I'm going to start by just sharing a little bit of contextual information about the code and the set of procedures that I mentioned. And we're not going to go through the code like line by line. I think that would make for a very long webinar. So instead, we're going to touch on the topics that I think kind of make the most sense for SEAL users to cover. So this presentation will be touching on the following topics: ILL policies, placing and filling requests, delivery, due dates and lending periods, renewals, dealing with lost and damaged items, and then service suspension. And then I'm going to end the webinar by leaving you with some helpful resources for interlibrary loan, some regional resources and also some national ones that can be a source for you to go to for any interlibrary loan questions that you might have. And I'll also be sending out the recording and PowerPoint for this presentation. And since we are touching on so many topics today, I do have a resource slide at the end of my presentation, which has a few quick links to several different resources. So I wanted to start by very briefly sharing a little bit more about the code and procedures, how they're monitored, how they're created. So Southeastern actually has a really long history of adopting a regional code to govern ILL within our 8-county region. And the code is always something that's agreed upon by all of the systems that are in our region. So our school library systems, our public library systems, and what we call the Southeastern system, which consists of academic libraries, special libraries, and hospital libraries. And the overall purpose of the code is to regulate ILL and provide some guidelines. And having the same code for everyone ensures consistency in the way that certain ILL workflows are approached. And all SEAL users do agree to abide by the code when they create their accounts. That's one of the things you have to check off as you're creating an account, meaning that everyone using SEAL should be following code recommendations. Southeastern has a regional interlibrary loan committee called RIC, which is comprised of this really great mixture of ILL practitioners from academic, special, school, and public libraries. And this committee reviews the code annually and suggests changes as needed. So any changes to the code also have to be approved by all of the systems in our region. So our current code was adopted in 2017, and the code adopts the United States Interlibrary Loan Code with explanatory supplement, which is a little bit of a mouthful. And this code was created by RUSA STARS, a national resource sharing committee that's part of the American Library Association. And they actually created this code with input from the ILL community all across the country. So we actually adopted the United States code as our code to make it easier for our libraries to comply with both regional and then national resource sharing standards, so there aren't any conflicts between the two. And then we have a few regional provisions that are kind of unique to just our area and then how we specifically manage ILL. And as I mentioned, we also have a set of procedures, and they're kind of a how-to document based off the code. For the most part, throughout this webinar, I will be referencing the code, but the procedures are also a really great resource too. And these are reviewed by Rick once a year. And unlike the code, which needs to be kind of approved by all of the systems, Rick can actually make minor changes to the procedures. And it was last updated in 2021. So these are a few screenshots of what the code looks like. To make things easier, instead of looking at this document, I kind of grouped a lot of the topics that are touched on in the code into kind of different topics like renewals, due dates, things like that. So, but I did want to share a few shots of what the code looks like so you can kind of have it in your mind and then explain how it's structured. I also wanted to drop the link to the code into the chat in case anyone wanted to open it up and kind of follow along. So I'm just going to drop that really quick. So these are just a few pages of the code, and it might look a little overwhelming at first, but it's not scary. The first page of the code, which is the image to the left, is a cover page that kind of lists all of the systems involved in our region, and it also lists some of the regional provisions that we have, like Southeastern will provide a union catalog. You can go to your regional systems for assistance. We also have a couple of exceptions to the national codes. You can see those are listed right there under exceptions. These are things that exist within the national code that wouldn't necessarily apply on a regional level. So for example, the code recommends lending internationally, but a lot of our libraries can't do that. It's quite expensive to mail something internationally. So as a result, we don't necessarily encourage it or discourage it. And another exception is that lending fees shouldn't be charging, or lending libraries, sorry, shouldn't be charging lending fees for regional items. So some ILO libraries charge a lending fee, which is usually like $10 to $15 for filling a request. So anything that's shared regionally, there shouldn't be any of those fees attached. However, libraries can kind of charge for lost or damaged items as they normally would. So the code has kind of a few different sections. In addition to a few definitions and some information on the scope, it is broken into borrowing and then lending responsibilities. And the code refers to them as requesting libraries and supplying libraries, but I tend to use those terms interchangeably. So the really helpful thing about the code, as you can see, is that, it lists the specific code, but then it has this long summary underneath it, which is in the kind of brownish color. And this explanation is so helpful because it provides some really great contextual information on why you might do certain things in ILL. And you can also see that every part of the code is assigned its own number. And so this can be really helpful for kind of referencing back to specific parts of the code. So one way or another throughout this webinar, we will touch on a lot of what the code has to say. I would also recommend maybe bookmarking it or printing it out so that you kind of have it for easy reference. I also wanted to show you a few screenshots of the procedures, and then I'm also going to share the link to these in case anyone wants to take a look at them. These procedures are designed to not be specific to any particular ILL system because a lot of our libraries are using different methods. We have some libraries using SEAL, some libraries using DocLine or OCLC products. But the procedures are helpful because they take a lot of what is in the code and break it into a concrete workflow. They also, you can kind of see from from this page, they'll reference the specific part of the code. So you can kind of go back and look and check why they make certain recommendations. So overall, they kind of break down what the code recommends into a specific workflow. We also have a few appendices on the procedures. So I have a screenshot of one here. So it has some information on some helpful information on a few other things, like it lists all the typical reasons that you could say no to an ILO request. And then we have this sheet that's all about how to place a MISP request to Southeastern. So this is a medical information services program request. So the procedures also have a few other helpful resources in addition to the workflows. So that's kind of our brief introduction into um, the code and the procedures, what they look like. So I wanted to transition now into actually going into some of the things that the code says about specific ILL best practices. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is policies. The very first recommendation in the code for both borrowing and lending libraries is to create a policy. So a borrowing policy is for the patrons at your library, and it sets out guidelines for your patrons for placing ILO requests to your library. And then on the lending side of things, these policies are constructed for borrowing libraries, and they typically lay out things like what item types you can provide, lending periods, renewals, and things of that nature. Um, we could honestly probably spend an entire webinar just talking about policies. So this is kind of going to be more of a quick overview, but I wanted to share some of the elements that you can kind of include in yours. And I looked at many, many different example policies, and they can really vary a lot. So some of the ones that I looked at were more like a set of procedures, so information for patrons on how they can place requests, like things on a website, something like that. Some were a few paragraphs that were included in a circulation policies, and then some libraries kind of have full ILL policies that have been approved by their boards. So you can kind of figure out what option works best for your library. At the very least, I would recommend having some kind of internal set of procedures for how your library will conduct ILL. And I'd be really happy to set up any kind of additional training around this topic if people were interested, like at a SEAL users group or maybe at a SIG or something like that. But just in general, having policies in place is so helpful for a number of reasons. So for one, policies can really help create consistency in how you manage ILL. So it'll make sure that you kind of handle each transaction the same from patron to patron. They can also be really helpful if you have a lot of turnover, you have staff who are out of the office. Policies can also save staff time. So for example, if you have in your policy that you can't request a certain item type that you know you probably won't get, something like a textbook or reference books, that can save your staff the time of, putting together a request for an item you probably won't be able to get. It's also a way that you can set limits on how many requests you'll fill. So if a patron comes in with 100 requests, you might be able to say, we only fill 10 requests per patron at a time. So this is kind of helpful in that regard. Policies can also be helpful for implementing consequences and for kind of giving library staff a safety net in a way, so you have something in place that you can point to if you're asked to do something that maybe you're not comfortable with, that you think maybe is violating copyright law or something like that. So they can be really helpful for that. So I'm going to share some common examples of both types of policies for borrowing libraries, policies for lending libraries, and then I'm going to share kind of a real world regional example of each, just so you can kind of see what it looks like out in the wild. So I wanted to start with borrowing policies for your patron. One of the kind of big purposes that these policies serve is actually explaining a little bit about how interlibrary loan works and setting some important expectations for the service. And this is helpful because a lot of patrons, especially at public libraries, are kind of used to the way that system holds work, so they can place it themselves, and it's going to be there in a matter of days. And so it's really important for them to know that interlibrary loan is different than that. It's going to take longer to show up, and they don't have any control over due dates, renewals, things like that. So a lot of the borrowing policies I've looked at, they started out with some contextual information about how that's a mouthful, how ILL works. And oftentimes this is actually structured in the form of an FAQ. So I saw a lot of libraries that actually just made FAQs instead of maybe a more traditional policy. So it would say, what is interlibrary loan? How does interlibrary loan work? And then it would kind of provide the answers to those questions. So that kind of includes that information. And sometimes I noticed that some libraries will also put in some kind of statement about how interlibrary loan supports the overall mission of their library. So another frequent component is eligibility requirements for patrons. So this is where you can determine who in your library can place requests. So some people limit it to certain patron types, like adult patrons. Some people might limit it to patrons whose accounts are currently in good standing. So things like that. Your policy is also where you can list out what items can and can't be requested through ILL. And generally, there are some materials that are going to be a little hard, if not impossible, to receive. So things like newly published books, ebooks, archival materials, textbook, reference books. So making that determination that you won't request certain items, that could save some staff time in placing those requests. And that's kind of something that you can determine for your library based on your experiences using ILL. A lot of policies also have a mention of copyright, so saying that patrons have to abide by copyright restrictions, and that can be helpful because if a patron asks you to get something that you think might violate copyright law, like 100 articles from a journal the same journal that all came out this year, or maybe like 60% of a whole book they want a scan of, those are things that might kind of raise some red flags. So you can have a statement within your policy that says you have to abide by copyright, and that also gives you something to kind of point to for saying why you can't do something. Workflow information is also often included in policy. So this just actually says how to submit a request. A lot of libraries have different ways of doing this. Some have forms, some have emails, or they ask people to bring citations to the front desk. So this can kind of break down how you should place a request, how long patrons have to pick an item up, and how to place or no requests. So lastly, a lot of policies that I looked at also included information on how fines work and any potential penalties they might face for lost or damaged books. So some of them said things like, the patron is responsible for the cost of the book if it's lost or damaged, or they might say, if you don't return the book, you might have some kind of consequence on your account, like you won't be able to check other things out and things like that. So I did want to show a real world example, and I reached out to this library and asked if it would be okay to show it. So this is a Mid-Hudson Library, Kent Public Library. So they actually have this on their website, and this kind of breaks down their process specifically for interlibrary loan requests, so outside of Mid-Hudson system holds. So kind of, I think, just personally, like the most important things for the policies are kind of setting expectations and providing that important workflow information of how to do this. And so this policy kind of, it makes it clear that this is different than system holds. It has some workflows like, before requesting the ILL, check to make sure that it's not available in Mid-Hudson. And they also lay out some restrictions. So, the item must be over a year old. They have some warnings, libraries are hesitant to send AV materials. And then they have kind of, mention about delivery. So please anticipate. They mentioned that delivery takes longer outside of the system than it would with their system courier. So all these things kind of help to set expectations for interlibrary loan service. And then it breaks down the workflows of how to actually submit a request and kind of what information you need. So every policy kind of looks different. So I actually, in the resource slide that I have at the end, I do have some other examples of borrowing policies. You can kind of see they all look a little bit different, but that's just one kind of real world example from our region. So I also wanted to share on the other side of the equation, policies that lending libraries create. And these policies are specifically for borrowing libraries, so they actually tend to be a little bit stripped down. They don't include a lot of that contextual information about how interlibrary loan works because they are geared towards libraries, and I think there's an assumption that they kind of understand it. Lending policies are a little unique in that a lot of our major ILO systems like OCLC, DocLine, they have a place where libraries can often enter in policy information. However, the code does kind of explicitly say that you should try, if possible, to have a lending policy available on a web page in addition to making it available through an ILO system. So a lot of libraries participate in multiple ILL services. So they might have SEAL and OCLC. They might be part of SUNY or other consortia. So a lot of the lending policies I looked at, they started off by listing the different services that they participate in. Typically, lending policies also include some information on the items that a library is able to lend and then what they won't lend. So common items that lending libraries decided not to lend were new books, reference materials, tire print journals, archival material, and things of that nature. A lending policy also often indicates information on the length of time that they are able to give for loans. And some libraries have different lengths of time for different materials. So a book might have a different lending period than, say, like a DVD or a CD or something like that, or a newer book. Lending policies are also where you can indicate if you're willing to grant renewals and how many you offer. And it kind of varies from library to library. Some will limit it to a certain amount, but others might continue to grant renewals on kind of a case-by-case basis. So a lot of them also include information on just like workflow instructions, like how to place a request to them, what shipping, I can't think of the word, which shipping they will use. So like some libraries use Empire Library Delivery, others use UPS. So it'll kind of say usually how we ship materials. And then they also usually include information on if they have lending fees, and then some things on fines, like when they consider an item to be overdue and at the point that they'll charge for it. So I kind of saw a huge range of times. Some libraries said 6 weeks, some said 8, some said 12. So that's again something that you kind of determine based on your library's needs. And then a lot of policies also have typically some contact information for specifically for the ILL department. So I also wanted to show you an example of this, and this was another kind of regional policy. This is from SUNY Ulster. So their policy was up on a LibGuide. So it actually had a tab for borrowing and a tab for lending, and then it had this kind of introductory paragraph. But I thought this is a good example. So you can see it has some of the elements that I touched on. So they mentioned that they participate in OCLC and they participate in SEAL. And then here they kind of lay out that they use ELD to ship. And when ELD is not an option, they use UPS or FedEx. And then they also have information about their lending period, 16 weeks, renewals, what they're able to lend, any copyright limitations. In their case, they say they won't lend more than 10% of a total number of pages for a book. And they also talk about kind of invoicing. So this is just another example of what a policy can look like. And as similar with the borrowing policies, I do have other examples that are all put into that resource sheet. I'm just going to pause for a second and see if there are any questions. And I'm going to move on to placing requests. So I'm just going to take some water really quickly. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some best practices for placing requests as seen in the code. And some of this might be a little bit of review to the SEAL 101 webinar that we did last month, but I feel like this is kind of helpful to go over it again. One of our big rules for regional ILL is that before using SEAL, you should always check your home library and then move on to your home library system if you're part of one. A lot of people have asked me if it's okay to go to SEAL if their library or system has the item, but it happens to be checked out or is temporarily unavailable. And I think that's totally fine. If you can't get the book through your system for any reason, I think it's okay to move to SEAL at that point. The code also says to make sure that you describe material accurately when placing a request. This is usually often when it comes to placing an article request. So this could mean verifying a citation just to make sure that you're placing a request, for the right item. So you can often verify citations in Google Scholar, even just by Googling an article title. So you typically want to make sure the information you have, like the article title, the journal, volume, issue, and page number is completely accurate. And this will save the lender a lot of time trying to kind of track down an item. And it can also mean kind of verifying the edition of the book they want, and then making sure that you place requests for the right item in SEAL. So another good in practice is to indicate a need by date if your patron happens to have one. And that's also something that's important to kind of set expectations with patrons when it comes to need by dates. So if they come in and they say they need an item by Friday and it's already Monday, it's probably not going to happen. However, if they have kind of a reasonable need by date for ILL, that could be useful to supply to the lending library. So they might know, oh, we don't have time to process this request by that deadline. So they'll kind of know that they need to pass on that particular request. One of the other things the code says is that it's important to ensure the confidentiality of your library patron. So the code says explicitly in section 4.2, interlibrary loan transactions like circulation transactions are confidential library records. Requesting libraries are discouraged from including a user's name on a request submitted to a supplier. To make this easier in Seal, we have added a patron field when you place a request that's only visible to the borrowing library. So it is important to keep that patron information in that field rather than putting it in the notes field where it can be seen by both libraries. But if you do have to include the patron's name in any communications with the lender, the code does recommend using barcodes or using some kind of other code that's unique to your library to protect the patron's privacy. The code also says in section 4.4 to note any special requirements about your request. So really the notes field in Seal is your first way of communicating with the lender. So this is the place where you can give them any information they might need to know whether or not they can fill your request. So you can provide clarification if needed. So for example, sometimes with serial items in Seal like comics and manga, it isn't always clear which volume is being requested. So the notes is actually a place where you could indicate the specific volume of an item you need if it's not otherwise apparent to the lender. In general, the code really emphasizes the importance of communication, and this is something I try to encourage too. I really recommend not being afraid to reach out to the other library in the transaction if there ever is a question, there's an issue, or there's just something that you need clarification on. So the code also says to understand copyright limitations when making a request. This is another thing that could, fully be an hour-long webinar. So this webinar isn't going to go too deeply into copyright. I do have some extra slides at the end that do talk about copyright in a little more detail. That's just because the majority of items that are requested through Seal are for what we call returnables, so physical items like books, DVDs, CDs. And the good news is that there's something called the first sale doctrine, which basically allows libraries to kind of do what they want with the physical items that they purchase. So you can put physical materials in the mail, you can lend them out, you can sell them, you can use them to build a giant tree in your library. So it's totally up to you what you want to do with your physical materials. Where copyright kind of becomes important is when you're requesting articles on behalf of patrons. So I'm going to give the world's quickest overview of copyright for interlibrary loan. And like I said, I do have some extra resources at the end. So any scans that you get through ILL, they become the property of the user. So they're not supposed to distribute those scans in any way. And they're supposed to be used for private scholarship, private study, things like that. It's also important that there's a copyright notice somewhere on the scan. So that might be provided by the lending library, but if not, there is actually kind of a boilerplate copyright statement that you can use up on the Seal LibGuide. The big thing with copyright is that it tries to kind of balance the rights of libraries with authors. So for this reason, it says that copies received shouldn't be in such quantities as to substitute for subscription or for purchase of the work. So for books, this usually roughly translates to like a chapter, or like 10% of the book is something that you can get scanned. And for journals, this kind of gets way more complicated, but one of the most common rules that people used to follow this kind of aggregate quantities rule is to do something called the rule of 5, which is kind of a huge tongue twister. So basically, you can request 5 articles published within the last 5 years in a calendar year. So that's kind of one way that you can make sure that you're not requesting too many copies of the same thing. And as I said, we have those extra resources at the end that kind of go into this a little more deeply. So that's another thing important when placing requests is, only if you're placing for an article or for like a book chapter, any kind of scan, basically. So the last thing is the copyright, or the the code says to kind of check the availability of an item and try to make sure that you request from a library that is having the item and that it's currently available. So there's also a few best practices for once you actually receive an item, and you can tell that I was having a little bit of fun with stock photos when I put this together. So kind of this is what I consider to be almost like the golden rule of ILL. So basically, the borrowing library assumes responsibility for any material they borrow from the moment that it's checked out to the moment that it's checked back onto the lender's shelf. Um, so that's something to kind of just remember once you uh, place an ILO request. Lenders can also indicate use restrictions for libraries. I don't think we see this a ton in SEAL, but it does happen. So sometimes the most common use restriction that you'll see is library use only, which might be used for fragile materials or for an older material. So if there ever is some kind of use restriction, that is something that borrowers do have to honor. You should also honor whatever due date is given and make sure to communicate this date with your patron. And you should also respond to any recalls for items. So recall is sometimes if a lender needs to get an item back, they'll issue a recall, which means you have to, get it back from the patron and send it. I don't really think they happen too often because in some cases it's actually quicker to just put in an ILL request for that item rather than wait for your copy to come back. But if it does happen, that's something that you have to honor as the borrowing library. So uh, another thing the code says is don't adhere anything to books. So that's why I have, stickers with, a slash through them. So don't put any stickers on the other library's books. You also shouldn't attempt to do any kind of sort of repairs on the material. So just leave the item as is and send it back to the lender. One other recommendation, I don't know that this is explicit in the code, but I think it's just a good practice is whenever you're communicating with the lender about a request, so maybe you're giving them a call or sending them an email, include the request ID when possible. So SEAL assigns request IDs to every request, and they're the same on both sides of the transaction. So having that ID handy when you're communicating with the lender is just going to be so helpful in them being able to look up the request quickly and kind of seeing what you're talking about. And so that can just make things go a little smoother. So I just wanted to stop briefly and see if there were any questions before I kind of move on to the next section, which is on the lending side of equation, so filling requests. Okay, so the code also has a lot of recommendations for lending libraries. One of the big things the code says is that lenders should try to respond to borrowing requests as quickly as they can, indicating whether or not they can fill an item. So the code states, process requests in a timely manner, recognizing the needs of the requesting library and or the requirements of the resource sharing system being used. If unable to fill a request, respond promptly and state the reason the request cannot be filled. So lenders have 4 business days typically to respond either affirmatively or negatively. In SEAL, we do require that lenders respond to requests. Even if you can't fill an item, that's totally okay if you can't fill it, but just be sure to, respond to the request instead of just letting it expire. Another good practice is to pay attention to any notes that come through in the borrowing request. So sometimes these notes might change, whether or not you're able to send an item. If there's anything special or unique about the request, that might be, something that you can't do. I've had instances before where I had a note that I overlooked and it would have changed like the whole workflow. So just be sure to check for any notes from the borrowing library. If you can't fill a SEAL request, we do have a drop-down menu where you can give an explicit reason why you can't fill it. We also have a notes field where you can provide some text to the borrowing library. So some people, when denying requests or saying they can't lend something, will use this space as a way to kind of communicate with the borrower. So they might say, oh, this item will be available in a few weeks, or, this is a newer item, try again in a few months. So this can be a helpful space to kind of give the borrower some helpful information on, their journey to get a copy of this item. Overall, lenders have kind of a lot of different determinations to make when they fill requests, and this is often kind of done on a case-by-case basis for items. So the code mentions that lenders should be aware of any copyright or licensing restrictions for an item. Again, this is often not a concern for seal because we are focused so much on physical items. Um, but when it comes to sending articles or scans of book, you do have to be aware of copyright limitations. So for example, if you get a request for a scan that's like half of a book, that could be a copyright violation, and you can say no to filling that request. And this is because the law states you can't supply more than what they call an aggregate quantity of a material. Um, so kind of based on your lending policy and any potential other restrictions or limitations, you have to determine if this is an item type that you're able to send. And if it is a physical material, once you get it off the shelf, I would check that it's just in good enough condition to survive the journey of being mailed to another library and then checked out to another library's patron. So I would recommend, if you notice any pre-existing damage to an item that's not severe enough for it to not be able to be lent out, to just make some kind of note of it. So this could be in the notes field when you go to fill a request and seal. This could be in your ILS, but in general, this will be a way of keeping track, so you won't think that the damage happened in the ILO process. You'll kind of know that it was a pre-existing issue. So the lender also has to determine a due date, and we're going to talk a little bit more about due dates in just a second. You also need to determine if there are any use restrictions. And if you do have any restrictions on lending this item or anything that's kind of maybe unique or specific, that could be a deal breaker for a borrower, the lender should reach out to the borrowing library to see if that would be suitable. In other ILO systems like OCLC World Show, there's something that's usually called a conditional response. So a lot of times you'll kind of get back to the borrowing library and say, we have this specific restriction. If that's okay, we can lend it, but if not, move on to somebody else. But we don't really have that in SEAL. So as the lending library, I would just shoot them an email or give them a call, just reach out to them and communicate what that restriction might be before you fill it. So lastly, you have to settle on a delivery method. And SEAL has, when you go to fill a request, a drop-down menu with some different options. So it can be helpful for the borrower if you include in the notes field the date the item was mailed. This can be helpful when we do ILO detective work to try and figure out, why an item hasn't arrived yet. So it can be really helpful just to know, kind of on both sides of the equation, when the item was shipped out. I actually have a lot more to say about delivery, so I have a whole slide about it. So I'm just going to move on to that. Just checking for any questions. Okay, so delivery I kind of consider delivery to be the backbone of ILL, but it can also be a little confusing. So I wanted to share some general best practices, and these are things, some of these are a little more regionally specific, and then some of them are things that I drew from the code. So just one good practice in general, try to include a copy of the request when you mail an item to the borrowing library. So some people might have a book jacket, they might include a printout of the initial seal request, or the email that you get. At any rate, including some kind of documentation that includes information on where the item is going is really helpful, especially if it has the ILL request ID. It's just going to serve a couple different purposes. It's going to make it easy for the borrowing library to check on the item, make sure it's the correct item. It's also going to help redirect items if they get lost in the mail. So you'll be able to check where this item was headed to and kind of redirect it. On the borrowing side, it can be good to try and save that ILO paperwork and return it back with the book if you can. So some people have different methods for how to do this. Like, I've seen some ILO books where they say, do not remove this in like big letters for the patron, or some people might just, have like a folder where they take the paperwork and kind of store it while the item is checked out to their patron. So there could be kind of different methods for how to do that, but returning it with some paperwork is also helpful for kind of the same reason, because the lender will be able to receive it and look up the request really easily. This is also recommended in the code, and I'm sure that it's not really a huge issue, but just for lenders, make sure that your library's name is visible, represented on the item somewhere. So if you're using public library system couriers, so RCLS or Mid-Hudson, just be sure to include the proper delivery slips. This will help make sorting the material so much easier for the delivery staff. And then if you're using Empire Library Delivery, make sure to kind of package items kind of appropriately based on ELD guidelines. And this is something that's really important. If you're delivering to a public library, be sure it's addressed to the home library system, not this specific library. And that's because the system is the ELD participant. So it might get turned back to you if you address it to the library instead of the system. If you ever need to identify a library system, there's actually a really easy way to look it up. If you head to the Seal ILL directory and search for the library, it'll show which system a library belongs to. The code also includes some good best practices when delivering items through other delivery vendors like FedEx, UPS, US Mail. And these are direct from the code section 4.15, which says package material to prevent damage or loss in shipping. So some recommendations: remove or mark out old addresses if you're reusing materials. Don't use old, frayed, or decaying packaging. Just make sure that all packages are clearly marked with the destination address and the return address. Tape is preferred over staples. In fact, I've heard a lot of ILO people say that, staples are, enemy number one. The code says staples are strongly discouraged in order to prevent injury. So use wrapping that's appropriate to the size of the material, and then use any internal wrapping like bubble wrap to avoid any kind of shifting or damage. And then one recommendation, if you're using library rate, US Mail, it's a library to library delivery. So I would recommend, if the library is part of a bigger institution, like it's, say, a hospital library, I would put the library first and then put the organization, just to make it clear that it is a delivery to delivery transaction. And I saw a question: where to search which system it belongs to? Oh yeah, so that's in the Seal directory, is where you can search. You can search a library's name and it'll bring up information on which system they belong to. Sometimes I often will do a search for public libraries. I'll go to a public library's website and then I'll go to their catalog, that's another way you can quickly see which system they belong to. I think the Seal directory parts of it are available if you don't have a Seal account. I'm not sure if the system portion is visible. I think it is usually, so you can still go to the Seal directory. Another way is just to go to the library's catalog and then try searching, and it'll usually be pretty clear once you search for something which catalog they belong to. And there's also a couple of lists of all the libraries that belong in a specific system. So on the Seal LibGuide, which I might be able to provide a link to in the chat. Let's see if I can get a window open. The Seal LibGuide has a delivery page, and that page also links to a list that lists off which system every library belongs to. So I'm going to put that link in the page too. Okay, this is the link to the Seal LibGuide, the delivery page. And so there is an Empire Library Delivery tab on that page that does link to where you can look up those members. So it's kind of visible in a few different places. Okay, so I'm going to move on to due dates and lending periods. So on the borrowing side of things, I wanted to start with this one quote from the code, because this is just something I think people maybe aren't always aware of. And its due dates are defined as the date the material is due to be checked in at the requesting library for return to the supplying library. And this is in section 5.7 of the code. So when it comes to ILL, the way we think of due dates is different than how we would think of an item that maybe we're lending to one of our home patrons. I've heard a few Seal users mention that they backdate due dates for their patrons so they can get it to the lending library by the due date, but you don't have to do that. It would be so hard, and it kind of an unreasonable expectation for someone to be able to guess how long an item could take in delivery getting back to the lending library. So kind of on the lending library side of things, this does mean kind of implementing something of a grace period before you think of an item as overdue, because there's a chance that it could have been checked in at the borrowing library by its due date, but it's now just kind of, making its way back to you. A common question I get from Seal users is whether we have a standardized lending period in Seal, and we don't have any set lending periods for items that are shared on a regional level. So lending periods are kind of always up to the supplying library. A lot of libraries do have their own preferences for lending periods, which can be based off of, an item type. So, but it is really important when setting a due date to keep in mind the length of time that it can take for an item to show up, which can often be 2 weeks or more. We've been seeing some kind of 3-week delivery times. Um, the borrowing library also needs some time to notify their patron and then give their patron a couple of days to pick up the item. So the code states in section 5.0, the supplying library is encouraged to establish as generous a loan period as its local environment allows. One kind of common recommendation I give for book loans is 5 weeks if possible, because that will include some time for delivery and would also give the patron at least a couple of weeks with the items. But again, lending periods in general, they're always up to the discretion of the lending library. So moving on to renewals, kind of in a similar vein, the code does have quite a few things to say about renewals. So one thing it says on the borrowing side of the equation, to request a renewal in advance of an item's due date. So this ensures that if the renewal isn't granted, it can still be returned on time. So I would typically recommend requesting renewals maybe a week or two in advance. It's kind of a delicate balance because you don't want to go too far in advance, because if they make the due date 4 weeks from when you request it, that could kind of eat into your patron's remaining time with an item. Just sort of a personal anecdote, one time, sometimes I do place book requests on behalf of Southeastern members. One time I requested a renewal because the patron reached out to me and like, I'm definitely going to need a renewal. So I requested it and it was only 2 weeks into the period, and the lender got back to me and was like, wait until we get closer to the due date to request a renewal. So I was like, okay, I won't make that mistake again. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. You can request renewals in a couple of different ways. So if you're using Seal, there is a way that you can easily request a renewal right from within the system. And there's a note field within the request where you can communicate with the lender anything important to know about your request, so like a desired due date, or share how much longer you need. Again, as with due dates, it's up to the lending library how long of a renewal they can give you. If you prefer, you can also reach out to those libraries directly to ask for a renewal. Now, one of the things the code does say is this, and this is another explicit quote: if the supplying library does not respond, the requesting library may assume a renewal has been granted, extending the due date by the same length of time as the original loan. So this is one of the things in the code that I would kind of recommend to take with a little bit of a caveat. I would actually recommend following up on a renewal if you place it through Seal and you don't hear back. And that's because Seal, sometimes it's easy to overlook an email. If someone is out of the office, they might not have seen the renewal email. So I would recommend, just before you assume that the renewal has been granted, maybe just following up like with a call or with an email, just to double check and see if that renewal is granted. If the lending library says no, send it back. And then if the item is already past due, try to return it as soon as possible. On the lender side of things, the code says that lenders should answer all renewal requests, either yes or no. And if you can grant a renewal, the due date is up to your library. And Seal has a place where you can put in your new due date right into the form. And if you can't approve the renewal, be sure to indicate that as well. So the code does recommend granting renewals when you can, if the material is not needed by a local user. Ultimately, whether you're willing to grant a renewal is up to you, and kind of how many renewals you'll grant is up to the lending library. I've seen it a lot of different ways in libraries. Some will just do one, some will do two, some will do it kind of, indefinitely. So that's one thing to kind of think about for your library. Okay, so Um, Moving on to lost and damaged items. So I actually split this section into two different scenarios because your actions might actually be a little different based on what happened. But overall, this section is going to deal with lost and damaged materials, how to deal with that, and some of what the code says about um, invoicing, because it does have some kind of explicit instructions on how to do that, which can be helpful if you're in this situation. So scenario number one is if a patron has damaged an item beyond repair, or the item is not returned by the patron. So sometimes that can happen. A patron moves away, items are lost, or they just aren't being responsive in terms of returning it. So as the borrowing library, once you know that an item is damaged or it's not going to be returned, the first thing to do is to reach out to the lending library and just kind of let them know about the situation. Just kind of be transparent about what's happening. And then the ball's kind of in the lender's court. So um, they can kind of decide whether or not they want to invoice. So per our code, lenders always have the option to bill for lost or damaged items, but they don't have to. That's something that's their decision. And the code does kind of encourage libraries to be willing to accept payments in different ways if they can. Some libraries will send out, an invoice for the value of the book. Some libraries will accept replacement copies of the same edition, but I've heard other libraries say that they prefer not to do that. So it's kind of a little bit different depending on your library. So whatever your replacement method is, that's something that should be communicated with the borrowing library. And the code does have a few explicit things to say about invoicing. So borrowing library should pay invoices or notify the lending library of a billing error within 6 months. Final overdue notices for books should be sent out no later than 6 months after the final due date. And then final bills for replacement of lost material should be sent out no later than 1 year after the final due date. So if you have a book that's lost or damaged, you shouldn't be sending out invoices, like 2 or 3 years after the fact. And then the code also says, if the borrowing library gets back to you about any sort of billing issues, be sure to resolve those within 6 months of receiving, a notice that there was an issue. So that's kind of what the code has to say about dealing with those situations. I think, as with a lot of the other things we talked about today, communication is just such a important part of kind of dealing with these situations. But I also wanted to share kind of a different scenario, which is that an item was lost in delivery. So let's say an item was filled in seal and it's been a few weeks and the item still hasn't shown up. So kind of what should you do? My first recommendation is to alert the lending library to the situation. I usually recommend waiting at least 3 weeks because we are seeing items take up to that long and sometimes longer to arrive. Sometimes the lending library will just say, give it another week and we'll just wait and see if it shows up. But this scenario is where a little bit of ILO investigation can come into play. And the code says, the requesting and supplier libraries may need to work together to resolve the matter. So there may have to be a little bit of collaboration and kind of figuring out maybe what happened. On the lending side of things, the lender can kind of supply information on, when the item was sent out and the method they used. The borrowing library, it's also good to just, double check that the item wasn't, maybe misplaced or misshelved. And the lending library can also check just to double check and make sure it wasn't sent back already through some kind of shipping error. If the delivery method that you're using has tracking, you might be able to log it that way. But unfortunately, a lot of the items that are sent through regional and ILL don't have tracking available. So if you're pretty confident that it never made it to your destination after being mailed, you can assume that it was lost in delivery. And this is where it can get a little tricky. In some cases, delivery vendors do offer, like ELD, they'll offer reimbursement for items lost in delivery. And that case is a little different from scenario one because the borrowing library might not have to pay for a refund. However, sometimes there are processing fees involved to kind of compensate for the time it takes, to maybe catalog a new book, purchase a new book. So that's usually like a $10 to $15 processing fee. So even if, someone else can reimburse for the cost of delivery, there might still be a processing fee of replacing that book. So like I said, the big thing that's emphasized in dealing with items lost in transit. It's just keeping the lines of communication open and kind of trying to work together and figure out, where this item might be. Oops. Okay, so this is our last topic before I share some of our kind of regional resources. I apologize, I might go a few minutes over the hour. In retrospect, I think I could have probably done a 90-minute webinar because there turned out to be a lot to say about the code. So the last thing I want to talk about was service suspension. So kind of making a determination that you won't lend items to a specific library. This is a hard thing to talk about because I guess I want to believe that everything goes along swimmingly. There's never any big issues, but it can happen. And I want to share what our code specifically says about suspending service. The code lays out pretty explicitly when service suspensions can happen. And this is in section 4.16, and it says, repeated or egregious breaches of this code may result in the requesting library's inability to obtain material. Examples of actions that may result in suspension include repeated failure to return loans in a timely manner, multiple lost or damaged items, allowing library use only items to leave the library, or failing to pay the supplier's charges. And this part I bolded on my own. So it says a supplying library should not suspend service to a requesting library without first attempting to resolve the issues or the problems. So I kind of put the emphasis on the last statement. So it's important before you suspend service to a library to try to work with them to resolve the issue, whether that means getting an invoice paid, trying to get an item back for a patron. And it's also kind of common that suspensions in the ILL world, except in kind of extreme circumstances or extreme bad behavior, they should also not be thought of as a kind of permanent ban, but more, ideally, if the issues are resolved, the borrower should be able to place requests again. So I try to encourage both sides of the IL equation to treat one another with grace. Sometimes there's kind of circumstances outside of an individual library's control, especially if that involves, struggling to get an item back from a patron. So just kind of summarize, service suspensions should ideally be rare, but they can be used as a consequence if you're having an issue with a particular item, like items not being returned, unpaid invoices or anything like that. Okay, so that's kind of everything that is the topics for the code. So I wanted to end by just giving you some resources to go to for help, because there are some situations in ILL that maybe are unique or that they don't fit, neatly into what the code says. And we all kind of experience, certain unique or kind of baffling situations, but fortunately there's a lot of really great ILL communities that you can kind of go to for help, and you can kind of ask people how they do things. So I want to start on a very regional level and then kind of move outwards to national and even international options. So the first place you can go if you happen to have CL or ILO requests is me, and I'm always happy to help out any way that I can. If the question happens to be something that's maybe out of my purview, like something that's specific to, like a public library system catalog or something like that, I can kind of point you to the person who might be best able to answer your question. And I like to think of it as being kind of an old-timey telephone operator, just like in the photo that I have in the slideshow. So I'll kind of put you in touch, help direct you to the person who can kind of help. And again, my email is kelsey@saylurk.org. A few more regional options. We do have a listserv that's just for SEAL. At the moment, this listserv is kind of being used as a way for me to share about upcoming events, but it's also meant to be a place where SEAL users could ask each other questions about, documentation, workflows, how they handle a certain situation. So if you head to the link on the screen, you can request to join the listserv. I also host virtual SEAL users group, and I try to do these at least once a year. I think our last one was in September or October. So we could also host SEAL users groups, and I'm always happy to take suggestions for topics. Like if there's something specific people want to talk about, I'm happy to have a SEAL users group that's just around, a specific topic. A little different from the SEAL users group, but kind of similar. We also have a regional special interest group, SIG. And the difference is that this is not specific to SEALs. So we have kind of a great eclectic mixture of people who come to these meetings from, academic libraries, hospital libraries, public libraries. So we just kind of meet periodically and we have some conversations about interlibrary loan. And we do actually have an interest group meeting coming up on June 13th from 1 to 3 p.m. And so that can be a resource if you want to talk to people who are doing this work and kind of ask questions. Those of you who belong to library systems, you might also have system email lists or meetings. That could also be a really good place to ask ILL questions. And just kind of my general experience, people are really very kind and often willing to share how they do things at their own libraries. And this is one of the reasons that have loved working in ILL. I've just found staff to be so helpful and generous and all around pretty great to work with. So moving outwards to kind of some more national and even international resources, there's this Facebook group that is specifically for ILL practitioners. It's called FB ILLers. This is a private group, meaning that posts aren't public, but anyone can ask to join. And people post a huge variety of things like, questions about software, tricky situations they're experiencing. They'll put in notices about upcoming professional development. So it's kind of a really great way to stay on top of what's happening in the broader ILL community. People also share fun things that are kind of specific to the ILO world, like ILO jokes or ILO memes. So it's kind of a good way to feel a sense of community around this work. And then last but not least, there's a general listserv that's managed by OCLC called ILL. This is another place where ILL practitioners go to share questions, they share information, they share new resources. This listserv is also used frequently as a place to ask for hard to get articles. Once there was an article that I spent days trying to get. I went through like every lender. They all said no. And then I posted it to the listserv as a last resort and I had a copy within a few minutes. My only kind of warning with this listserv is that it does generate a lot of emails within a day because of all the article requests. So that's just something to kind of be aware of. I've also included a link here to my ILL resources libguide. I have many different libguides. It's one of my favorite things to do is make libguides. So I have a SEAL libguide, but I also have this resources for ILO libguide, which it has information on more ILO listservs that you could join, some kind of different ones. It also has information on statewide and national conferences, which could also be kind of a good way to meet people doing ILO work. So kind of overall, you never have to feel like you're alone in this work. And as I mentioned, I have compiled a resource list. So I do have all these resources on the slide, and I'll be sharing out the presentation with everybody. So you'll be able to have access to all of this. Okay, so that's everything for my presentation. So just wanted to check in and see if anyone had any questions. Oh yeah, feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions, and we'll work on getting the recording and getting the presentation sent out to everybody. So thank you so much for coming today. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the Zoom. Thanks everybody for coming.